Next on KQED Newsroom, undercover police tactics fuel controversy as protests continue.
We don't get no justice!
The impact of this week's Pineapple Express, the aftermath and implications for California's drought. Plus, a momentous time for Bay Area sports, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. This week, protests continued over the shootings of unarmed black males by white police officers.
Students, the free speech movement is not just a relic of 50 years ago, it's alive today.
Demonstrations swept through several Bay Area cities. Many were peaceful, but there were also clashes with police and cases of vandalism. On Wednesday, an incident involving an undercover police officer sparked additional controversy. We'll have Scott Schaefer's discussion with protest organizers in a moment. But first, I'm joined by San Francisco Chronicle reporter Vivian to talk about the debate that continues to swirl around what happened Wednesday night. Vivian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
For people who aren't completely familiar with the Oakland incident, can you give a quick recap of what happened?
Well, it began like a lot of other protests these recent weeks. It began very peacefully. There were about 100 people marching, and it started in Berkeley and then ended up in Oakland. And somewhere in Oakland, around Lake Merritt, two police officers were sort of outed by the crowd. Two people, some people in the crowd recognized them as police officers and, began challenging them a little bit.
And they were plain clothes?
They were plain clothes, yes, and they were wearing masks over their faces. And a bit of a tussle resulted from this. One of the protesters took a hat from one of the officers, and according to CHP, somebody punched the officer in the head, and then the crowd started coming in on these two officers, forcing the officer to draw a gun.
So was the officer justified in drawing the gun?
Well, CHP says, the CHP chief Avery Brown says that they're very much justified. He says that the officer pulled the gun, had originally pulled the baton out first. He claims that when he pulled the baton out, he also pulled a badge out, as is CHP policy. However, other protesters that were there, our freelance photographer who was there, who got that photograph of the gun pointed right at the camera, he said he did not see a badge or anything like that.
Now, some protesters have disputed the CHP's account, of course, and also there are some lawyers who feel that this was really completely unjustified. Oakland has a crowd control ordinance in place. This was the CHP, but it took place in Oakland. Is this a violation of Oakland's crowd control ordinance?
Well, when it comes to mutual aid, according to attorney Jim Channon, who represented a protester who was very seriously injured during the Occupy protest, when it comes to mutual aid, the police department that is in charge of that jurisdiction should be the one closest and most upfront with the group. Those plainclothes officers, they were closer than Oakland police.
But doesn't the ordinance say that you have to be in an emergency situation, feel your life is being imminently threatened before drawing that weapon? And under that policy, is this justified?
I was always, I've been to a few police department trainings when it comes to weapons, and it was the saying is you do not pull your weapon unless you're willing to shoot it. In this case, this officer has been criticized a lot because when it was pulled out, his finger wasn't on the trigger. It seemed like he was just using it to intimidate the crowd. But as Chief Brown had mentioned, this officer very much feared for his life. The crowd was coming in. His partner was on the ground. He had just gotten hit in the head, and he was very much fearful for his life.
Few people would dispute that police officers have a tough time out there. I mean, they're night after night, they're working long hours to provide some kind of control and security with these protests. They're subjected to abuse. There are splinter groups of anarchists they have to deal with. You've been out covering a number of these protests. What is the environment like? Even your photographer said he felt scared. Definitely.
It's when you get a bunch of people together at once, it's always going to be a tense situation, especially with these recent protests. They've been focusing on police brutality and injustices within the policing in this nation. With that, there have been very tense moments between the police and protesters. Protesters will yell at the police officers. They'll throw bottles and rocks at them. And at the same time, some of the police officers will respond with more force than a lot of people say is really necessary. It's been tense at times, but it's come from both ends. That night, our photographer told me that he was actually more scared of the protesters because they prevented him from taking photos. They actually tried to take his memory card at one point. But other nights when police officers are shooting off less than lethals, deploying tear gas, other people have told me that they were scared of the police officers at that point.
So this incident has inflamed tensions, of course, between officers and protesters. Where do we go from here? Is there talk of filing charges or disciplinary action or any reassessment of when officers draw their weapons and when it's appropriate to be in a crowd in plain clothes and not identify themselves?
The police, the California Highway Patrol, that officer who pulled his weapon is still on active duty. Chief Brown has said that he does not believe he's done anything wrong, that he was acting out of fear for his life, but that there is an investigation going on for use of force, as in any kind of sort of situation like this. Meanwhile, he defends his plainclothes officers. He defends the use of using them in these protests, even though for CHP their main objective is to protect the freeways. He says that they were there to collect intel to hear what the protesters were saying.
Okay. Well, we will see where it goes from here. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
And now we'd like to take a closer look at what the protesters hope to accomplish. Scott Schaefer sat down earlier with two of the organizers.
It was 50 years ago this month that the free speech movement was born at UC Berkeley. Some say the ongoing protests this past week are in keeping with that tradition of civil disobedience. Joining me now to talk about their involvement in the movement are Yvette Felarca with the group By Any Means Necessary, and Zachary Murray, who helped organize a unique African-American protest called Black Brunch. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Yvette. Your group was one of the key organizers of these protests over the past 10 days or so. What was your goal, and do you feel like it's been accomplished?
Well, our goal is to build a new civil rights movement, to take a stand against racism, most immediately to get Darren Wilson jailed and win justice for Michael Brown and
the police
Eric
officer
Garner.
who killed Michael Brown.
Yes. Yeah, and our goal is to really build that movement. That's what BAM exists for, and to make sure that young people are able to come forward and we can shift the balance of power on the side against racism and against the new Jim Crow.
Why do you think these protests have struck such a chord, not just here in the Bay Area, but across the country?
I think that the level of racism in the society is worse than it's been in most people's lives who are alive today. And it's a new Jim Crow that we're seeing. But why we're seeing so many people come forward is because people recognize we've got to build an independent movement that takes mass, militant, direct action.
Independent of what?
Independent of the major political parties, independent of major politicians, but also one that really takes a stand against the grand jury system as a whole, that repudiates that grand jury decision in Ferguson and fights to make an example out of Darren Wilson to show that no more are we going to allow any racist police officers use a badge as a license to kill. Those days have to be over.
And Zach, what about you? Well, what would you add to that? What inspired you to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I have been sort of waiting for a long time for a moment to get involved, for this to sort of catch on, for more people to see that we need to take action. I mean, more generally, I'm interested in justice, and I think black folks have a disproportionate experience with injustice in this country, and it's time for us to stand up and to start speaking about those things and to demand concrete change of the system. I think I completely agree that there needs to be an independent movement because our political parties, both of them, have failed us. And, you know, a lot of times are sort of dealing with these injustices the exact same. And I think a lot of young people are looking for something different, looking towards opportunity to really make an impact.
Yvette, tell us about the tactics, because one of the things, for example, that got a lot of publicity was going onto the freeways, Highway 24. Do you feel like, what do you feel like that accomplished? And do you feel like you're done with that? Or what was the purpose of it, and what's next?
Yeah, I think the tactics are driven by what we're fighting for, and then have to be flexible on the basis of that. I think the highways have gotten a lot of attention, and that's really important. But we've also got to build a movement that's then accomplishing our goals. So in order to get not just Darren Wilson, but starting with him, but other police officers jailed, we've got to build a mass movement that takes direct action in other ways too.
Yeah.
And so one of those things that we're organizing is a whole campaign to get as many student groups, community organizations, unions, municipalities like city councils to sign statements and to call formally for the repudiation of that grand jury decision and to jail Darren Wilson.
Let me ask you, Zach, these protests were mostly peaceful. There were a few isolated incidents of violence. What did you take away from that part of the coverage, the media coverage, and how did that influence you at all in your decision to do this Black Brunch?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of been attending these protests since the very beginning, since the verdict out of Ferguson, and immediately was sort of thrown off a little bit by the demographics of the crowd. I didn't feel that folks who were experiencing the rage, right, of having another Black man experience death and injustice in that, that those folks weren't really super represented in the audience. I looked around and didn't see folks who I was very familiar with and sort of felt uncomfortable initially, and so we organized Black Brunch in response to that, right, to create space for our healing, because ultimately there's a lot of real pain that this situation in Ferguson, that the situation in Staten Island has caused, and we need to create space for healing, but also create space so that people can understand that pain and understand that it's very real and that it's something that needs to be addressed. And
tell us about Black Brunch. There was a few dozen of you that went into some upscale restaurants in the Rock Ridge area of Oakland. Yeah. What did you do in the restaurant? Yeah, the goal of Black Brunch was to carry the weight of our pain into communities and to people who don't regularly have to think about it. And so we went into the different establishments and chanted, but also mentioned the fact that every 28 hours, a Black person, a man, a woman, or child is murdered by a police, by a security guard, by an armed vigilante, and that we want to remember their names, and that we're also ensuring that the people in the establishment will remember their names, that we will no longer accept business as usual. Business as usual is every 28 hours a Black person is murdered in this country by police. We won't accept that, and we're going to disrupt business as usual as long as that business continues. Yeah. Yvette, it's been more than 20 years since the Rodney King verdict and the riots in Los Angeles, and some would say not much has changed, or at least not enough has changed. What's going to be different this time? What will it take to really make a fundamental change in the system?
I think that we've got to have new leadership that comes forward, and new young leaders to come forward and really fight to channel that anger and rage that is going to continue to grow as long as these killer police officers are allowed to go free. And that's what BAM seeks to do. We are looking for new young leaders who want to who really want to make a fight and make a change and change history in our direction. And
I'm sorry to cut you out. And Zach, just in the last few seconds we have, do you feel like you're in it for the long haul? Yeah, and I think that organizers have to begin to take these outrageous examples like in Ferguson, like Staten Island, and present the local links. Ferguson, Black folks there are arrested 3 times more than non-Black folks, but in Oakland, it's a 5 times greater rate of arrest. In San Francisco, it's an astounding 10.8 times greater rate of arrest among Black folks and non-Black folks. And so if we're going to be serious about this, we have to address the concrete instances of injustice. All right, Zach Murray, Black Brunch organizer, and Yvette Felarca, by any means necessary. Thank you both very much. I'm sure lots more to talk about on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And still to come, a stormy season for the 49ers, but smooth sailing for other local teams. And speaking of storms, the Bay Area is still recovering from Thursday's deluge, which dumps from 2 to 6 inches of rainfall in one day. For many cities, it was the wettest day since 1995. The severe weather flooded highways, streets, and homes and spurred several school districts to close. Do the heavy rains spell any relief for California's severe 3-year drought? And what are the climate and weather patterns at play? On tap with me now is Ellen Hannock, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome back to the program, Ellen.
Thank you.
You lead the PPIC's water policy research. Does this week's big storm make a big difference?
It makes a difference. I just got an email from a farmer friend in the Central Valley who was all excited about having gotten an inch and a half of rain on his fields. So yeah, people are happy about it, but it doesn't mean the drought's over.
So what else needs to happen? And it was a big storm. I was reading some numbers today, 166 billion gallons from this storm, enough for 2.5 million Californians per year. But you're saying it doesn't nearly go far enough. So what else needs to happen?
So this is early in our rainy season. We're probably a little bit ahead of average for today, but our rainy season lasts all the way through April, and we've got to have another few big storms in order to really catch up. The estimate is that we need 150% of normal in order to catch up because it's been so dry for the last 3 years.
So we've got quite a ways to go. What does it mean for the environment? This rainfall must have been great for the ecosystem and the salmon runs, I would imagine.
These big storms are part of California's naturally variable climate to get these big storms like this, and so our native species are pretty well adapted to it, so it's great for them.
A study recently published by the American Geophysical Union found this is California's worst drought in 1,200 years. That's so astounding when you think about it. You're smiling, meaning that you agree or you disagree?
So I think, there are a lot of different ways you can slice and dice the numbers. And by some metrics, you can say, this was, in terms of the number of years of dryness since we've been measuring rainfall, this has been the 3 driest years in a row that we've had. So yeah, it's been a bad drought. It's not the single driest year in history by some other measures. I think, those are sort of for the scientists to
Sure.
have some fun with, but it's been dry.
No matter how you slice it, it's still a bad drought. Is there a link between the current drought and climate change?
That's also something that scientists have been looking at to try to see whether or not this drought is consistent with what the models are saying, are predicting for California. What we know is that California has been getting more and more variable weather, with droughts being longer and the wet bursts being shorter and more intense, and that's expected to continue. We also know that this was the hottest year on record. That is undisputed. What is the big question for some of the folks that are looking at the sort of climate science now is, can you pinpoint this particular drought and say it's caused by climate change? And that's up for debate.
So you're right, there is some dispute, and some people are saying, no, it's just natural climate variability. But there's a school of thought out there that, while that may be true, greenhouse gases, wouldn't they lead to increased heating, which would then enhance dry conditions?
For sure. And we know, I mean, you can look at California's temperatures over the past 90 years. The past 3 decades have been much warmer than any time in the previous 9 decades, and this last year was the hottest on record. So clearly we're seeing a warming trend, and when it's drier, that makes any drought feel more dry because it dries out the soils.
So how does the recently passed water bond help us prepare for dry years?
So the bond has a lot of things in it that can help California become more resilient. And a lot of people have focused on the fact that there's some money in there to help build storage or to help with underground storage facilities that can help store water for droughts. But there's also money in there to help us become more resilient in terms of more water use efficiency, cleaning up some groundwater basins that are polluted, and so on. So it's got a lot of things that will help.
So what's the bottom line, Ellen? Should we prepare for next year being dry as well? And do we have to prepare for floods as well?
We have to always be prepared for both droughts and floods. And we can't know what the coming year is going to be like until we get a few more storms.
So in the short term, conserve, conserve, and conserve.
There you go.
All right. Ellen Hannock with the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, what a time to be a Bay Area sports lover. Giants and Warriors fans have much to celebrate. Giants pitcher Madison Bumgarner was named Sportsman of the Year by Sports Illustrated this week. The Warriors are on an amazing winning streak and, to the relief of many, decided to redo the design for their new stadium, which was ridiculed for looking like a toilet. Not all is well, though. The 49ers are having a rough season, sparking questions about Coach Jim Harbaugh's future. Scott Schaefer sat down earlier with sports writer Mark Purdy to get the lowdown.
Mark Purdy, what a great time to be a sports writer, huh?
Oh, yeah. You never have to worry when you get up in the morning, is there going to be anything to do?
Well, let's start with the best news of all, basketball.
Yeah.
The NBA Golden State Warriors off to their best start ever, 19-2. They've won 14 straight. What difference do you think having this coach, Steve Kerr, has made to this team?
Well, this particular team, I mean, there's always that debate in the National Basketball Association about how much coach makes the difference versus the players, because the players are on the court and and they make more money than the coach, and so they can kind of control the action they want. I think in this case, what Steve Kerr has done is really tap into the mindset of his best players, which every coach has to do, and he trusts them. I think he might trust them a little more than the previous coach, Mark Jackson, did. Mark Jackson did a really good job teaching that team defense. Offense, okay. But Kerr, he really trusts Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson, his two guards. And the other night in one of the games, close game, down the stretch, when usually a coach would call timeout after a rebound, and instead, he didn't call timeout. He let Curry come down, bring the ball by himself, and made a game-winning shot.
So he's getting more out of his players, you're saying?
I think he's getting more consistently. You know, those guys were good, and they are good. But I think consistently, you know, to go on a winning streak like this, you've got to be consistently good. You can't just be good now and then. That's what happened.
And unlike some teams, they're really playing as a team, right? They're not depending on one guy like a LeBron James.
Right. Well, I think they did that under Jackson too, but I think in this case, I think he's allowed those guys to play together as a team more, if this makes any sense, as they want to play together as a team. And that, when they buy in that way, that's when you really got something good.
Yeah. Well, let's stay in Oakland and talk about the A's, because Billy Beane, the general manager, known for Moneyball and pulling rabbits out of hats all the time.
I think he just made a trade while we were talking.
He probably did. He might have traded me or you, for all I know. But, wow, he's dismantled a team that was beloved by the fans.
Yeah. Well, but this is the way Billy Beane operates, and if it's possible, the A's fans have kind of become used to it. I don't get as much blowback on that as they would think you would.
From fans? From
fans, yeah. You know, and I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook and email, and I hear a lot from the fans. Billy Beane has done this. He's turned over the team several times. He's been general manager for 17 years. They've made the playoffs 8 of those 17 years. So the fans have kind of come to trust him. That said, it's really hard to be an A's fan because you just get dizzy every year. There's a new cast of characters, and you cannot get really attached to any of them. Well, it's almost like a social experiment.
Well, I wonder if it works the other way too, where maybe the players don't feel as attached to the team.
Well, there's always that question about the internal clubhouse dynamic and what that means. Like, can I really get to be friends with this guy when he might be gone? But in today's baseball, there's so much player movement. If you just look at the guys that are just going to be inducted in the Hall of Fame. In the old days, Joe DiMaggio played for one team, right? The guys being inducted today, they've usually played for several teams, and there's always that debate about which logo goes on their cap, right?
Yeah, or how they're going to retire and be.
Yeah, you know.
Sometimes they'll come back for a game.
So it's just the way baseball is today. Players move around a lot more.
Yeah. Let's talk football. 49ers hit a low, I think it's fair to say, last week. They lost to the Raiders in Oakland. The Raiders were ecstatic because they've been horrible this year. When you look at the 49ers slide this year, what stands out for you?
Well, what stands out for me is first, there's been a real kind of rumbling and gurgling and indigestion in the relationship between the owner, Jed York, the general manager, Trent Baalke, and the head coach, Jim Harbaugh. Last offseason, this crazy story surfaced that I didn't even believe at first, which was that they were going to somehow trade the head coach to Cleveland for something, and I said, that sounded crazy. But it turned out there were some legs to it, and when you're a player and you hear like, what? Wait, they're going to trade our coach? I do think it has some effect. Jim Harbaugh said, it shouldn't matter, we're playing football. But as you watch that team this year, the defense has been fine, but the offense, it's just like watching a nervous breakdown out there. And I don't know, you know, you can take a pie chart and assign for that. The offensive line has been hurt, and the quarterback has not played well. He doesn't seem confident. The wide receivers aren't getting open. But I think it still does stem back from like starting at the front office stuff.
So the quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, is Harbaugh's guy.
Yes.
You know, so if Harbaugh leaves, what's Colin Kaepernick's future?
That's a very good question. The contract he signed is such that, yes, he gets some guaranteed money, but there are outs for the 49ers more than other quarterbacks have with other teams. So I think it'll depend on who the new coach is. I mean, you and I are sitting here, and I guess assuming there's going to be a new coach, there's no guarantee of that. Jim Harbaugh's contract runs through next season. And he's going to want to get paid that. He's not going to quit because he's owed $5 million next season from the 49ers. So he's either going to make them fire him, or maybe they will try to work out some trade. Whoever the new coach is has to love the quarterback as much as Jim Harbaugh loved the quarterback, or it could get real interesting.
And just before I let you go, Mark, we've seen a real increase in the number of athletes participating in social movements with St. Louis Rams, with the hands up, don't shoot, LeBron James and others with the I Can't Breathe t-shirts, all references to the police killings of unarmed black men. What do you make of that? Is this a new trend? Why is it happening?
I think it's happening because you know, I think these guys, particularly the NBA guys today, are more connected to the world than their predecessors were 20 years ago with the social media and listening to the fans. I think they kind of plug into that more than guys 20 years ago. You know, Muhammad Ali was socially active, did this stuff. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the San Jose State guys who did the fist, and they got heavily criticized for it. So the next generation of athletes, Michael Jordan, purposely was not political, and I think the other athletes of his generation followed him. He was afraid it hurt his endorsements. The fact that LeBron James put on one of those t-shirts the other night, I think that gives the other guys clearance to do it. It's going to be interesting to see how the sports leagues try to handle this.
All right, Mark Purdy from the San Jose Mercury News. Thanks a lot. It was fun.
Sure, great.
And that is all for tonight. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good night.